Good morning, afternoon, or evening to all those who are tuning in to today's session on intercultural competencies, and inclusivity in engineering. My name is Rachel Law, and I'll be moderating today's mini panels. So this session is divided into two mini panels, and the goal of each 45-minute mini panel will be centered around intersectionality and empathy in engineering, as well as the human-centered engineer. Panelists will represent different technical and cultural backgrounds, and each mini panel will feature 2 to 3 main questions, along and followed by Q&A. So we'll get started with our keynote speaker for the panel, is Dr. Mira Olsen. Dr. Mira Olsen is an associate professor in the Civil, Architectural, and Environmental Engineering Department at Drexel University. She holds a BS in Mechanical Engineering and a Bachelor's of Arts in Environmental Sciences and Engineering from Rice University, and an ME and PhD in Civil Environmental Engineering from the University of Virginia. The broad focus of her research is on protecting source water quality with current interest in transboundary water management and community-based research design. Dr. Olsen is an editor of the International Journal of Engineering, Social Justice and Peace, and has served as faculty fellow in Drexel's Office of University and Community Partnerships. She's a co-founder and director of the newly established Peace Engineering program at Drexel. Dr. Mira Olsen, everyone.
Hi, everyone. I'm just going to pause to share my screen briefly. Great. That all okay? Okay, great. Well, thank you. I'm so glad to be with you here today. And I really want to thank the panel organizers for planning such an interesting and generative session. I am especially looking forward to hearing from all these other panelists, and of course, hearing from you and your questions as well. So as Rachel said, my name is Mira Olsen. I work at Drexel University in Philadelphia. And while my background is in water resources and environmental engineering, more recently I've been working to develop and launch a new peace engineering program, which I'll tell you a little more about later, but it helps prepare engineers to work as better partners, really in complex situations like conflict zones or fragile nations, or post-disaster, or really even local communities, and to incorporate conflict sensitivity into their work. So I want to start off by asking you to imagine what it would be like if all engineers, or even like all engineering work, supported environmental protection, social justice, human rights, and peace. And of course, some of it already does, but as we know, unfortunately, some of it also enforces the norms or the inequities that work against these ideals. So I think a lot about how we pivot, and how do we pivot in an existing industry? It's not like we're starting from scratch. So how do we elevate these values within engineering education and the workplace? And what are the new modes of engagement, of research, of development, of design that will help us get there? And here, I like to think that peace engineering is a good start. Really, we approach all of our work and from the very beginning, developing the curriculum, the research, the engagement, the design, all of it through partnership. It's sort of integral to everything that we do. Peace engineering, the program that we've built, merges engineering with social and applied sciences, and with peace building. And it has kind of two purposes. It's got the dual purposes of both integrating more of engineering and the technical analysis and engineering into peace building practice, but at the same time infusing conflict sensitivity and peace building skills into the engineering design process and practice. And for us, it really grew out of a partnership between a group of engineers and a community of peace builders, which haven't necessarily worked together in the past. So in our case, we work really closely with the Peace Tech Lab, which is it's a tech spinoff of the United States Institute of Peace. And their mission is they're dedicated to using technology, media, and data to support and accelerate local peace building efforts in communities affected by conflict. So it was a partnership in which both parties, the College of Engineering at Drexel and the Peace Tech Lab, we had different missions and goals, but we were able to focus on what we could build together, which ultimately improved both of our original practices. I like to think that the engineering program and the way that they approach peace building is improved because of this collaboration, but also create a new mode of engagement between two partners. And as I said, partnership is really worked in and integral to all of the work that we do. It's kind of a basic tenet for us. And of course, also critical to advancing intersectionality. But working in true partnership isn't necessarily as easy as it sounds. I mean, it seems like it should be easy, right? But it does take some effort, and I'll admit some mistakes along the way to figure out how to work together. So this image that you see of the overlapping spheres, this was put together by the East Parkside neighborhood in West Philadelphia. It's a neighborhood that's adjacent to Drexel, and it was actually proposed by them at the very beginning of a community partnered project that we were working on. And these are the themes that were important to them for community partnership, like for like basic tenets of being able to work together, being responsive, sharing information, getting people involved, building power within the community. And my favorite was meeting people where they are instead of trying to make them into something different. And of course, at the center of this is trust. That's what we were going for. And I really appreciated this insight from them. And I think, you know, this kind of understanding needs to be established at the beginning of any partnership and checked in again with like along the way. I found it so valuable in being able to work together as partners. Now, another key challenge, in my opinion, is figuring out how to value what everyone brings to a partnership. And again, this seems like it should be easy and intuitive, but you know, deep down, people value their own opinions differently than they do other people's. So even though like the very reason that we work in partnership is because of the advantages that different partners bring, it's actually quite difficult to appreciate and incorporate what everyone brings to the table. And so if we think about this more broadly, if we think about intersectionality across disciplines, we can see a progression from very siloed work where different partners may bring different skills and expertise, and they may even fit together and be additive, which is great, but they're not really additive, or they're not really integrated. And our goal is to try to move past that. So on this arrow, to try to move to the right and to find ways to integrate that. So I like to think of it, it's almost like the ingredients that people bring to bake a cake together. Sure, you could like eat them all separately and that would probably be fine. But it's even better if you mix them together and make something new. And that's when you get this transdisciplinarity. That's when you get this integration beyond what anyone's individual expertise or discipline can bring. And that's when you can start to create a shared identity and shared goals that go beyond those of individual partners. But as I mentioned, there are often barriers to this type of collaboration and partnership. To get to this sort of shared identity and intersectionality, we have to be able to balance the individual goals and identities of each of the partners and what they bring. And these are quite complicated. If you think even of an individual person, a person's professional identity is comprised of their own values and beliefs and attitudes, as well as the expectations of their training or supporting organizations or funders or professional societies. This is certainly true of engineers. We really like to talk a lot about technical rigor, and this is the type of thing that we bring to our work, and it shapes how we value other people's work. And this gets in the way a lot of times in partnerships. So just as we bring our own values, beliefs, and sort of formations and shapes, so do our other partners. And so to be perfectly honest, how do we not think that our way is better than everyone else's and get to a place that we're actually valuing the contributions of our partners? I think that's kind of a central question in creating this transdisciplinarity and this intersectionality across different disciplines. And I'm talking broadly about disciplines, but it doesn't have to be. Collaborations and partnerships are not necessarily where people are coming from academic disciplines. I mean, from people's point of views, whatever they bring to a partnership. And so while I'm not sure that I have the answers, I do think that it comes from working and learning together. So actually like doing the work together, not doing pieces separately and bringing together, but actually coming together from the beginning and doing the learning process together. So at Drexel, we have a couple of mechanisms for doing this. My favorite is that we teach classes that are side by side, meaning that half of the students in the class are Drexel students and half of the participants are community members that are not enrolled at the university, but do participate as equal members in the classroom. I'm actually really excited to be teaching one of these in the spring. It's on places of justice, where we'll look at both traditional and non-traditional places where justice is either challenged or advanced. And also we'll be looking at the role of engineering and infrastructure broadly, so how that plays in and how it shapes everything. So I think this kind of learning side by side promotes inclusivity in engineering. I think you think of the engineering process as slightly broader in terms of who's helping to create the learning, the new material. And I also think it'll encourage engineers to work on problems or realms that they don't typically see as engineering work. So it might have engineering students working in realms where they really didn't think that they were qualified to work. And at Drexel, we also have students working in some of those areas. We have students who are working on urban gun violence, where starting that project, they were thinking, you know, I have no expertise in this area. What am I doing working in this area? And, you know, protecting civilians from harm and conflict and disaster recovery. So problems that aren't typically engineering problems, but problems in which we might be good partners if we can show up as good partners, if we can listen and come with a sense of humility and be there to learn and share and not necessarily lead. So I have two goals for us as engineers. I'd love to see us working to promote diversity and inclusivity, but I'd also like to see us represented in some of the big global challenges of our time that are not necessarily disciplined to engineering. So with that, I'll thank you. I definitely welcome comments and questions either now in the chat or after the panels. And I've included my contact information here in case anyone wants to follow up. We'll stop.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Olson, for a really great keynote. If you have any questions, I guess to our audience members, if you have any questions, definitely feel free to use the chat bar and the Event Mobi site if you are streaming from there. Great, so it seems like we already have great global engagement. Friends joining us from Ireland, Cape Town, India, Malawi. Feel free to use, like I said, the chat bar to introduce yourself and keep asking questions. It's always really exciting to see who's joining us from all around the world. And so I'm now going to turn your attention to our participants for today's panel and allow them to introduce themselves. Faith, off to you.
Thank you. So my name is Faith Mzandu. I am a civil engineer by profession. I'm from Lilongwe, Malawi, the capital city of Malawi. Apparently Malawi is the warm heart of Africa. I am passionate about STEM, particularly seeing gender diversity in the engineering industry. So I am the co-founder of Women Engineering Malawi, a subsidiary of Women Engineering Global, Women Global, and I've been running the STEM program since 2017. Thank you.
Great. Our next panelist is Ashley.
Hey everyone, my name is Ashley Elliott. I'm reaching out from Seattle where it's early in the morning. And I'm so excited to hear the keynote just now because it explains everything in my life so perfectly. I love peace engineering. I'm a member of the Stanford, the Peace Innovation Network, and I'm also a polymath. And so I'm so excited to talk to folks about my experiences building out inclusion. So I study cultures and I also study people, how people interact with technologies, where they are. And then I just flip and switch to a different perspective to understand where they are. And that really has helped me in building out peace application to train peace builders about human rights, the Sustainable Development Goals, and how to build peace in their communities around the world, and knowing how to test that and make sure that it's working in local communities in an anti-colonial mindset. So I'm super excited to join you today.
Great. Our next panelist is Dr. Frank Brook.
Yeah, hello everyone. Very nice to be here. It's for me a great opportunity to be in a different context. I'm maybe the only non-engineering scholar here, and that's quite exciting to hear the different end of the spectrum sometimes. I'm a business scholar myself in intercultural management mostly. I'm an Austrian who lives in South Africa now for 10 years here in Cape Town, where I'm working at the University of Stellenbosch, but mostly I am a consultant for, well, 25 or more years in cross-cultural issues, whatever it is. Preparing people to go to different cultures or the like. And in this capacity, I had a lot of experiences with engineering participants, and also about the stereotypes about engineering and learning for engineering, and how they would be able to deal with social contexts. And I'm happy to be here to say something about that, maybe also because I think the stereotypes are sometimes a self-reference, which is not correct, and engineers should definitely involve in projects like the peace projects and the like. I find that really exciting. And just the last thing is that I'm working in a big sustainability research global research network, and that's my other connection to the field.
Great, thank you. And last but certainly not least, Aisha too.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here, also with my fellow Peace Innovation Lab member, Ashley. So I'm a peace advisor and innovator. I'm currently based in Benin, and I work for a regional West Africa program that works in Benin, Niger, and Burkina Faso. And I'm also working as a post-colonial tech ethnographer. So I have a really transdisciplinary approach with a focus on pluriversal consumer visions, and I work at the intersection of emerging technologies, data, design, art, and peace. So peace is really what I'm focusing on the most, and I'm currently a member of the Leading with Artificial Intelligence Lab that is organized by the International Labour Organization of the UN. And there I've been working also towards building AI for peace. And my most recent projects explore the development of AI ecosystems that address the needs of African countries. So my aspiration is to build Hausa NLP out in the real world applications that cater for the needs of Africans on the continent and in the diaspora. But what I'm really what really guides me always is I want to advance how we can imagine, design, deploy technologies for peace and for a world that is more just, equitable, and secure for all. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you to our panelists for introducing themselves. We will now get started on our panel questions. Our first person to answer our first question will be Faith. And then panelists can jump on in if they have an answer as well. So when was the first time you just had to listen in your experience as in working in this area?
Well, the first time I had to listen was when I realized that I was in a place of privilege than those that were around me. And that was when I was a student in varsity. And at the time, the number of the intake of students had gone higher than the hostel space that was there on campus, on the college campus. And so there were hostels closer to campus, but only students who are coming from, only students who can afford that accommodation were able to be housed close to campus. And what I didn't see within my classmates at the time was that a majority of the female engineering students were not selected for hostel space or could not afford those that accommodation close to campus. And when I sat down and talked to them, and I'd see them tired every morning they came to work, they came to class, and it was because when they got off class, they had the responsibility to still run house chores. And then I could imagine an engineering final year student battling to get good grades, but then having to have those social cultural norms where they have to go back and still take care of their families. And so that prompted me to sit down with them and write a letter to our then head of department, and also wrote to the Dean of Engineering how they could work with the Dean of Students and have some of the students on campus. And funny enough, a majority of the male classmates had hostel space. Only I think 2 out of the 25, and then out of the 13 girls, only 1 had hostel space, which meant that during the evening, they had access to the school library, to discussions, which this female students didn't have. So for me, I realized, okay, in my place of privilege as a leader, how can I help those that are around me that are less privileged than I am, being able to be close to the school library as I'm finishing my final year, being able not to do house chores as I am doing my studies.
Great, thank you so much, Faith. And any other panelists, feel free to jump in.
Maybe I would like to say something here. As we're talking about empathy, I think it is important that we actually define what we mean by that and how it's being used. So empathy is like the first step in design thinking, because it can allow us to understand and share the same feelings that the others feel. So the aim of empathy in design thinking practice is to be able to put ourselves in other people's shoes, right? And to connect with how they might feel about their problems, circumstances, or situation. And maybe interesting for students who are listening, it's always important to ask yourself these questions, you know, what is the person feeling? What actions or words indicate this feeling? And also, can you identify their feelings through words? So when you asked about, you know, when was the first time you were listening? Listening is, in any practice, the very first step, because in order to understand and enter a space that isn't your own, you have to really comprehend what the other person is saying. And maybe I want to challenge everyone also to think about, you know, critically reflecting also about the practice. I'm a post-colonial researcher, so when I think about empathy, I can find a few problems that can arise, right? So when I think about it, sometimes I wonder, you know, how could I possibly comprehend the full experience of all the users without having gone through the experience myself, right? If you imagine designing for someone who is disabled, I could never understand their situation. Or I've got a really good example. For instance, if you go to the airport, and normally when you go through security, you get scanned, right? So the way it was designed, it will scan your body and identify whether you're a boy or a girl. So having these kind of binary designs and not incorporating maybe transgender people or people who are not conform to any gender identity might create a system whereby when they enter the space, they're not truly identified or recognized. So me as a Black person, if I was wearing an afro, for instance, and I would go through that security system, it wouldn't truly identify me because they have a certain data set of what they think a Black person should look like. So as soon as you don't have straight hair and you go through the security system, someone will search through your hair, right? So I just want to make aware of the fact that we as designers, when we talk about empathy, what we should aspire to is not to be the creators or the main engineers, but to invite everyone who's involved in the design process to be part of it, and to be aware that I see myself as a peace advisor, but in my role, I'm not someone who is living the conflict that I'm working on, but I'm inviting all the people who are part of the conflict to participate in the design of activities, of strategies. So I see myself more as a translator, of someone who translates between the different actors, as someone who's facilitating, who's creating the space so that the actors themselves have the agency, and also as someone who's witnessing what is going on, you know. So empathy for me means that we have to also critically reflect our own position as designers, and to be aware of our own unconscious bias. Everyone has unconscious bias, so empathy shouldn't be the first step, but reflection. Thank you.
Yeah, I can add on to that, and I actually really appreciate both of your comments for there. I fully admit to being one of those sort of blinders on engineers for a good part of my training and early career. And I think one of the most empowering things that I went through is to start doing community-based learning and research. I went through a 3-day training, and as part of it, we visited a prison, and we're participating in a workshop with the inmates there who are all serving life sentences. And we were generating material where we were looking at the effects of privilege and different things that impart privilege. So we were working together, but just like you said, that first step of listening to people and was a very stark, so addressing your biases, this is probably one of the most stark examples that I had of that. So anytime you work in a community that is not your own, or you work with someone who is not you, you bring your implicit biases. And this was probably the most extreme that I had experienced. And everyone who was coming in, we had our biases, and we tried to break those down. And so really just starting with listening to everyone's stories, and then knowing that we were going to be working together was so critical and just so empowering. Just, we learned so much from that. And so the very importance of that, we put that in an extreme situation, but it translates to sort of any partnership or design process as well. So thanks for asking that question about listening, because that's certainly an important step.
Yeah, I'd love to add on. So Aishatu, thank you so much for mentioning, the experience of being non-binary and trying to get through security. That happens to colleagues of mine all the time. So two things about me that I didn't mention is, one, that I'm a member of the LGBTQIA community, and a lot of the things that I experience really push against that binary that people have. And the other is that I have multiple different types of disabilities. And so this question about listening for me is very different, because I have a hearing problem. I have a very difficult time hearing, and on occasion have a difficult time because of a brain injury speaking. And so my way to learn how to listen was really watching and observing, which is why I love ethnographic research, and being a sponge and understanding what's going on and how people are interacting with each other, instead of using language. Because oftentimes one of the things that I love about being part of this community is I come from an experience of compounded violence. And so there's so many times when I can't speak and I can't listen. And so when you're interacting with other people and designing technologies and interventions and conversations across those different types of barriers, particularly with people who are in communities facing violence, whether it's intergenerational or situational, is that you can no longer rely on listening, because there's no longer words, or maybe the words, across culture or across language, it's no longer sufficient. And so really going in and watching how people do different things, how do people interact. And then I actually had the most amazing experience when I started working with children who had autism, and also children who were in either human trafficking or migrant situations, where there just could not be any reliance on language, and everything was on nonverbal communication. And so I'm 90 to 95% nonverbal communication, and can walk into any situation and I can watch the antecedent of what's going to happen, or the behavior and what's going to happen afterwards. And so learning to do that in reverse. So when you're designing these solutions, what's happening? And then, okay, what was the situation? And then what happened? And doing it in different directions. And another part that I love is that no one knows that I'm a member of the queer community or the deaf community when I walk into a room. And so it's really fun for me to just watch people react, as far as what Aishatu said, to who they think I am in the room until I open my mouth. And really just watching, it's so much fun as far as having this skill set, is when people interact with you with their biases, and then watching how it shifts in 100% nonverbal ways once they realize who you are, is so much fun. Thanks for asking that question.
Can I maybe add one part here about the listening? And I think a lot of it has been said already, very well put. There's one thing that I always tell people. So I lived in many different countries throughout my career, but I always tell people when you move to a different culture again, right? Like when I lived in India, very different from my Austrian place where I came from. Is the first thing is you learn a lot about yourself. And this listening goes a bit with this self-reflection, right? It is really most important to monitor also your own reactions to what is happening around you. It is good to listen. It's most important also to absorb, and it's very important to then bring this in the context also with your own values and beliefs, with your own ways to structure your life, right? So even if it's only to question yourself, why do I react negatively on this now, right? If something happens, and not to kind of have the reflex action, there's something wrong, but to ask yourself first, why do I react? Why does it trigger something in me? And maybe this gives you a different basis to look at different situations, at different behavior, and so forth. So I think it's most important to link all these three parts together.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for great answers to these questions. Our second question, Dr. Mira Olsen will answer. How do you recommend we change engineering curricula to help future engineers navigate problems outside of their own experiences?
Yeah, I can take that one first, and then I'm excited to hear what everyone else has to say. Even before we change the what, I think we can change the how. How we teach engineering education. The education itself is very hierarchical. And I think one good thing that's come out of virtual learning and a pandemic and everyone in this new and strange situation is that we've taken a step back and sort of approach teaching and education at a more personal level. So checking in with students at the beginning and saying, like, just figuring out where everyone's coming from, what their world looks like, because it's changed so drastically. Normally in a class, you at least have that one space where everyone has a shared experience. We're all sitting in a classroom together, and that was no longer the case. And I think a lot of people took the time, a lot of instructors took the time to try to set up that shared space and figuring out where everyone was coming from. And halfway through, I was talking with a bunch of colleagues and we said, why don't we always do that? Why don't all of our classes start with empathy? Why do we start with this, even just walking into the classroom, it sets this tone and this hierarchy that really shouldn't be there in education. So even before we change the what, I think we can absolutely change the how.
Great, thank you so much. Any of our other panelists?
Yeah, I think when thinking about that question, I can only talk from my experience as being a peace practitioner in the field in Africa. So when I work, the kind of tools that I value a lot help me to gain insights into the conflict dynamics, and especially developing these through open dialogue, empathy, and also acknowledging that the people that we design for and with are the people who are the experts of their own lived experience. So having that in mind, I would think that as a peace practitioner, I would advise maybe these curricula to incorporate transdisciplinary tools. So for instance, I would think that ethnographic participatory action research is an amazing tool because it includes all the stakeholders in the process. So they're also part of developing the strategy, doing the monitoring, the evaluation. It centers the perspective of the people who are often marginalized, and it promotes an inclusive problem solving, right? So because it's not our problem that we're solving with engineering or with peace but practices, but it's the problems or the situations of others. So I think this is like a unique opportunity to advance these kind of techniques. And I can give an example. For instance, I work on a conflict between nomadic cattle herders and farmers. It's one of the bloodiest conflicts in Africa, and right now, which you can find in Nigeria, in Burkina Faso, in Ghana, in Ethiopia, in Niger, in Benin, you can find this conflict. And what I do in order to change perspectives, I have this tool which is called the onion exercise. So, like an onion, you know, it has different layers. So, the outer layer represents the positions, the middle layer, the interests, and the center is the needs, right? So, this tool, I use it very often together with all the stakeholders so that they can reflect about their own positions, interests, and needs. And then one thing that I like to do to change perspective, for instance, the nomadic cattle herders, I ask them to identify the positions, interests, and needs of the farmers and vice versa. So this makes them actually put themselves in the shoes of the other, and at the same time creates critical reflection and understanding. Because in order to understand the other, you have to be able to ask yourself the questions what this other person is going through. So this is just an example. I think there's so many interesting tools. If there was a way to have this kind of collaboration between people in the field and people who are in the academia, I think that could create an interesting curriculum.
I definitely
Great,
want to
thank-
add. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, please. Rachel, go ahead.
Oh no, I just wanted to add one thing. So after this question, we'll be starting a Q&A. We're going to let the rest of our panelists answer. Feel free to use the chat bar to add any questions that you have for our panelists or their responses. All right. Sorry, Ashley.
No, it's great. I wanted to pick the who. So we had the how, and so I wanted to pick the who for who are the engineers. And so which question makes more sense? Is it easier to train engineers on how to have these, you know, multidisciplinary experiences, and also, you know, how to be nimble and how to move from these different spaces and understand and empathize with different people going through different situations? Or could we reconsider who are the engineers? So for example, myself, I'm one of the individuals who is in STEM and engineering, biology, pre-medicine for a decade before experiencing severe violence and sexual violence. And that's something that deterred me from moving forward. So I am an engineer, but for the last 25 years, I haven't been an engineer because I had this thing happen in my life that really changed the trajectory of where I ended up. And so really looking at some of the UN Security Council's 1325 that has to do with women in peace, as well as 2250 that has to do with youth in peace, and building on what Faith said earlier about if there's not women in these programs and they're not being able to kind of move forward, or what Aishatu said, and people are at the periphery, these people who have the skills and the knowledge of what's going on, and they already understand the problem sets, what can you do to make engineering more inclusive so that the people who already comprehend how to do this are engineers? And so something that came up on our previous conversation was, I've been doing this work for a really long time, but I didn't know that I was an engineer until this morning. So, you know, I had developed an application, I've been doing all these different things, but I did not know that I was an engineer until today. And so I think that there's a really big mismatch between who's in engineering and who's an engineer, and articulating that, and then putting those pieces together, particularly for people who've been derailed either by different types of violence, exclusions, or sexual violence, particularly for women, specifically because we have an African focus on the call and what Faith mentioned earlier and what I know about Aishatu's work.
Yeah. I think for me, just to add, one of the first definitions not necessarily first, but one of the definitions of an engineer that got me into engineering was that somebody told me that an engineer is a people's person. And I said, what do you mean an engineer is a people's person? They meant that they solve problems of the community. And I think keeping programs community-based and realizing that engineers must know that solving problems is beyond themselves. It's beyond the small circles that they're in. It's beyond the small environments that they're in. It's bigger than that. We're talking about the SDGs. How can engineers solve problems for a global community? So it is about looking beyond ourselves. What is happening, being aware of what is happening in our environment. This happened, I wasn't even aware that there's a 66% dropout rate of thermal engineering college students. And then from learning that, also what is happening, how can I improve in my community? What is happening in my community? Being aware, whether it's in my design, being aware. And one of the examples I would give is that, for instance, in Milongo, in the capital city, most people don't know that 70% of the population live in informal settlements. Despite there being traffic delays and then there being need to expand our roads within the urban cities, what about the largest 70% of the population that depend on agricultural products, agriculture and vending to survive? How can we provide transportation systems that can reach those people to come to the cities, be able to find something to alleviate their poverty? So it is beyond ourselves. Should I, as an engineer, focus on the increased number of vehicles that people are buying that is causing these traffic delays? Or should I also look at the 70% that are living in informal settlements, mud houses with thatched roof, with a mud house with an iron sheets on top? How can I make their lives easier? And also a part of that economic development, economic journey that we're taking as we're expanding our urban cities. So it is looking within our community. What are the problems within our community? So that is engineering beyond ourselves. It is beyond the individual. It is beyond the solving, the technical aspect of solving it. It is the wider community.
There is one aspect, knowing very little about engineering education, to be honest. However, working with engineers and seeing, as I mentioned also in the beginning, the kind of auto stereotypes of engineers. And I fully agree that there's this community serving aspect to it. What we very often have when we work across disciplines is the communication aspect, and this would be something where I could imagine that engineering education could pick up more and put attention on it. I say this simply because we have experience in this, particularly in sustainability projects. The SDGs were mentioned and so forth. There is very often this additional translation between sort of cultures, right? Different national cultures, and then we have this additional translation necessary between a technical to a communal or business language, also in many cases. And this is far less trivial than people may think it is, and I think it's a bit underrated. That you may have the greatest ideas, but if the communication aspect lags behind a bit, there is a bit of a mismatch in this context sometimes, and you may not be able to bring the ideas across. So as I feel that this is something where that's true for many studies, where we very much look at aspects of expertise and skills. However, we often forget the soft skills, and the soft skills and an add-on you can add on yourself, or learn it in practice. But I think this is maybe not the best way to go ahead with it, but to integrate it right from the beginning and multidisciplinary. And this project, Mira, you mentioned, I find very exciting, where the community comes to the campus also, and these qualities, these skills are already, the communication skills are already practiced there.
Great. Thank you so much to everyone who just offered responses. We're going to get started in our Q&A section of our panel. So our first question, what is diversity in engineering? And feel free to offer any response that you might have.
So I'm just looking through the list of, but in terms of diversity in engineering, you know, I think it's diverse ways of thinking. I think it's diverse voices. I think it's people who have not, you know, engineering as a discipline. I guess I'll take it from a discipline, because I think that's different than engineering in practice. Because as Ashley said, people are engineers who are not trained as engineers, or who may not identify as engineers, just like peace builders as well. People would look up and say, oh, I guess I am building and creating peace. I didn't know I was a peace builder. So there's the how you work as an engineer, which is, I'll take Faith's, what brought her into engineering. It's a for people problems. It's addressing things that people need. And as a discipline and an educational system, I think there's a disconnect between that a little bit. So I think diversity in engineering education has to get a little bit more back to those principles that drew us to it, why we want to be engineers. It's taking community, it's working with communities and solving some of these problems that we don't know how to solve. And so I think the diversity comes into bringing different voices and not having it be so didactic. And part of this is just a challenge in the educational process. We feel like there's so much technical material to impart that we kind of lose sight of the bigger picture of why we want to encourage change in the first place. What we're trying to do, we're trying to make things better at the simplest level. But what better is and what is more advanced is kind of given to us in definitions and in the structure that is engineering. So I think breaking it down and saying that diversity is including all of the voices, all of the people, all of the different disciplines, all of the different users, experiencers, and the people who are not even using whatever we're designing into engineering. So just broadening who's part of the engineering process.
I think I would even add here, diversity doesn't only mean that you're incorporating a diverse set of people. It also means moving away from universalizing concepts. So if we talk about diversity in engineering, we should include non-Western ways of knowing and thinking, because that can enrich really the way the debate around engineering and move it towards maybe the future. Because many disciplines have a very Western-centric philosophical tradition. So incorporating indigenous or Western or African traditions into this, so that we have more of a pluriversal mindset, that I think that would be a really interesting step.
There's also a absolute quality that we see in diverse teams, right? The design thinking process was mentioned before, and we have quite a few studies which clearly prove that diverse teams are by far superior in the performance where creativity is needed, where creative outcomes are expected. So the more uniform the task, the more challenge may come up with any type of diversity. I'm not even thinking in a special direction, but the more different perspectives you have in a team, the stronger this can influence the development of thinking out of the box, right, and the development of very creative new solutions.
I think just to add, not necessarily might not be a definition, but I think it's moving away from traditional methods of engineering that have not worked to be inclusive. Suddenly, the ways of thinking, the traditional ways of thinking that we have been accustomed to doing things in engineering, moving away from those that do not allow for a diverse environment or an inclusive environment. Thank you.
Great. Thank you to our panelists for answering this question. And then another Q&A. So do we have a professional and personal identity? For example, one audience member says, my values, beliefs, and attitudes shape the way I behave. I cannot separate my work persona from my personal persona. Do any of our panelists have a response?
Yeah, let me take that one because I talk to students about this a lot, and I'm glad to hear that you're able to integrate your personal and professional persona. I think maybe this is a US problem, that our students feel very split. They feel very much like they have their personal persona, what's important to them, their attitudes, their belief, what they want to do. And that's kind of why they choose engineering. And then as a product of our educational system as it is, that gets beaten out of them. And so, you know, we shove down the technical and sort of we isolate problems to make them simpler to solve them in our education system. And people lose sight of why they went into engineering. So I talk with a lot of students who are coming towards the end of their studies and they say, you know, I've been trained to do this and I just feel a disconnect between how I'm trained professionally and what I actually want to be doing with my life. And they said, you know, I could work as an engineer and then continue to volunteer in communities, but it doesn't feel like they have an integration. And I think what I've learned working around the world is that this is not true in many other cultures. I think there's more of a melding of the personal and the professional beliefs. And I don't know if that's a product of the educational system or just, you know, culturally different, but I think that's what we'd all like to move towards. And I think that's a shortcoming right now of at least the US-based educational system is that we're not allowing people to match up professionally their personal beliefs as well.
Maybe I can give an example from a real life example from my work as a peace engineer, as I would call it now. I would say that once you finish university and you're looking for a job, you would look for something that actually fits with your own philosophy, right? So I'm a peace advisor, and if you look at each profession, they all have their codes of conduct, right? So you look at the codes of conduct, their value systems, their missions, and if that aligns with who you are, then your professional and your personal identity will be melting together because they represent everything that you believe in as well. And for me, as a peace advisor, one of the main principles is do no harm. So whatever we do when we're doing interventions, we try to be aware already of how our own intervention can cause harm, and we try to find solution of how we can reduce how we can reduce making the situation worse through our intervention. So I totally believe in this principle. I think it's important to always reflect on these things. And as a peace advisor, what we try to do is to create peaceful, just, and inclusive society. So that's my mantra. So for me, there's no separation between my professional and personal identity. When I plan, strategize, I do it with a post-colonial perspective, and I always include all the stakeholders. So I think it really depends on which job you choose in the end.
Yeah, in the integration, there's a lot of merit also for your happiness in your life and consistency in your life there. I'm not sure if you're aware of the Japanese life philosophy called Ikigai, which is a quite important principle where you try to integrate what you're good at, what you love to do, what the world needs, very importantly, right, in terms of sustainability, and what you can make a living from, right? So basically that means if you're able to integrate these spheres of your life in a positive way, you may reach this ikigai, which is then not only a balanced life, but a very dynamic way to live your life in all the contexts, and you can be one, right? The worst, I did quite a bit of research on that, and the worst that we see in the West is maybe what Mira mentioned before, are the people who live leave their offices and then want to start to live, because whatever they do there is not part of their life. They feel, now this is my persona, now leave this change the head. Right now I'm a person, and there I'm, I don't know what, an engineer, manager, whatever it is, doesn't matter. So the integration is quite important, and of course definitely culturally different, how you can achieve that, how easily you can achieve that.
I would like to add that I think that everybody can see the SDG wheel that's next to my head. It's right there. I don't know how to point and go in the right direction to get there, but I do want to have everyone to think about, so there's a bright red color that's kind of close to my glasses right there. I'm touching it. Okay, so that's gender equality. And then I want everybody to think about the hot pink. I can't point to it because my directions are mirrored, but I want everyone to think about the hot pink. And I would just want to be American for a second, because then I'm American, and do a full stop on the question. The question can be flipped around. And so the question about what you do in inclusion and making sure that you have inclusive engineering and in integration or interventions, it's not about welcoming your identity specifically and you needing to split your personal and professional identity. It's about the hot pink. And the hot pink is SDG 10, which says reducing inequalities, and 10.2, which says eliminating the exclusions, the social exclusions, the political exclusions, and the social exclusions that people face. So every single color on this wheel represents something different, whether it's education, food, water, and energy, access to infrastructure. For some of the people on the call, there's no infrastructure. And so it's less about creating inclusion that makes sure that everyone's welcome, but making sure that you create things that don't prevent anyone from doing all of the things on the circle. And so one thing that is often a problem in these kind of conversations is people want to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion from a standpoint of including everyone. And that can be weaponized. That's a potential harm because of white supremacy and a lot of the other tactics that are being used, where people want to say, I want to be part of your organization. You need to accept and include my belief system. And that can create a lot of friction across cultures, and especially across generations and cultures. And so what I do want to tell everybody about is that this entire wheel and inclusion is really about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and everything that has to do with inclusion is based on this wheel and understanding how the wheel works and how people would be prevented from 10.2, that hot pink. So it's a different question than what you're asking, and when you switch it, the answer is very different.
Great. Thank you so much to our panelists who offered some really great responses to our Q&A questions. We're gonna transition into the second part of this session, which focuses, it's the same layout, it's just a different panel theme. And so our second mini panel is focused on the human-centered engineer. And so our first question is for Ashley. What do you see as some of the main characteristics of a human-centered engineer? And what questions do you ask yourself to keep a human-centered focus? Okay.
Sure. I travel the world. And so I do peace tours, and I also do ethnographic research, and I also do climate-related research. And so I want to understand what people are going through. What are their, so for example, last year I did helicopter tours, underwater tours, any type of tour to understand what bleaching was doing to people's, and evaporation was doing to people's access to water, who guards the water, and then visiting South America and understanding who's trying to exploit the water, and understanding how just access to different natural resources, the basic needs, which is SDGs 1 through 6 on the wheel behind my head, and understanding how people interact with those with things in their real life, what's really creating those barriers. And then there's this really cool sphere, which is like a physics awesomeness, which is constantly expanding whatever direction you go in. And so what I like to do as a person who I code switch. And so I understand the code switching that individuals from other backgrounds and communities go through in order to communicate with people where I am. And so my preference is I'll code switch, and then as if I was on this wheel, I'll just switch to a different color, and then try to figure it out from the people who have interviewed or talked to. What would their experience with it be? And understanding like a pluralistic view of what I'm trying to create. So if I was, for example, you mentioned the Japanese culture, if I was creating a presentation for individuals from Germany, Australia, Japan, and the Netherlands, and Brussels, Belgium, I would need to do some serious work to make sure that it reached all of those audiences. And if I wanted to do that and increase like the individuals coming from Malawi who are here, and have it be more conversational, how do you do all those things? And really switching your perspective all around the sphere. That's how I do it.
Can I maybe add something here from the human-centered engineer? I find it interesting because I work in a project that's called the human-centered enterprise. So it's basically the same thing because of course everyone collaborates there, and we found that one of the most important parts was the interaction with the stakeholders, with the whole ecosystem you're operating in, no matter if you're an engineer, if you're a manager, or whatever you would like to be addressed like. It is the exchange, hence the communication is an important factor again, with the needs and beliefs and whatever the values of your stakeholders. Not always will you be able to fulfill all that and will go in the right direction, but you need to be certainly mindful of that. And here I would like to come back to something that was said in the first panel, if you allow me, on empathy, because the definition of empathy was there mentioned as to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, and this is this is often misunderstood, and the source for quite a bit of confusion, because to put yourself in somebody else's shoes would mean still that you are the one who is the one who is thinking and judging what's needed and so forth, right? So the assumption that other people, so the golden rule, right? It's in every culture it exists, and it basically says treat others the way you want to be treated yourself. That works really well as long as the others are the way you are. But if we have the assumption that there's somebody is different, it is a different game. So it's not enough to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, but you must really understand this person. You must really go out of your own mindsets and try to understand what needs are there, what values are there, and how can the same thing look from a very different perspective. And I think that's very important for human-centered anything, particularly also engineering, of course.
Any of our other panelists?
I think for me, I can add from an African perspective, and which is something maybe I brought up when we were preparing Cities of Tomorrow, one of the sessions, was that I said, in as much as we're talking about the fourth industrial revolution and then urbanization, and Africa is trying so hard to catch up to the urbanization in Western countries and Eastern countries, whether it's Asia, Europe, or America. We are trying to catch up in terms of urbanization, yet those economies or those countries are trying to tackle climate change. Now, in terms of us rushing to have more manufacturing companies, more in terms of design, we want the tallest structures. We are cutting down trees to increase our, in terms of housing. Now, how can we design our environments to also be able to curb some of those issues in terms of climate change? Not to say just looking at urbanization, but how can we improve our environment so that we're also adding to the betterment of our environment and not only rushing after urbanization? So I think the question is every design for us? I think that's one of the questions, when it's human-centered focus, is every design necessary if it's going to have a very big environmental impact as well? So I think when you look at human-centered focus is, yes, we're trying to rush in terms of technology, but is this really necessary? What is really the most important thing? Should I bring 5G to a 5G technology to a rural area, or should I bring electricity or solar power? What is the efficient thing that will actually bring impact, and also on a global scale to improve the environment as well?
I completely agree and see the importance of bringing both environmental justice and social justice into the design space.
Great. So our next question for our panel is, how do you recommend we change, as in like what can we add, change, modify to our experiences in engineering, namely curricula, but it also just be to education in general, to keep humanity centered in a heavily technical area of study. And the first person answering our question will be Asia too.
Thank you so much. So I wanted to first listen to what everyone was saying about human-centered design, because I would like to invite you to challenge that concept. Because if you think of human-centered design, it's very anthropocentric. So it's like a pyramid, right? The human is on top and everybody else is below. And my guiding questions in everything I do is, how can we make a world that is actually more equitable and just and ecologically sustainable? So if you're asking these questions, then you have to actually have a paradigm shift towards environment-centered design. And for me, human-centered design overlooks the incorporation of environmental and non-human factors into the design process. And I think environment-centered design aims to fill that void by adding what is missing. And that is non-human actors, animals, plants, the environment. And if you think of environment-centered design, I think of it more like a circle, right? Everyone is in it. There's no hierarchy. Every actor is important. So for me, it would be really interesting to see if this could be incorporated in a curriculum, to think about other actors that are strategically important for the development of projects. And also the importance of non-human actors, because I will give you an example. Who would ever think that a non-human stakeholder would be the most important actor right now? And I'm talking about COVID-19 here. It's the actor number one who's influencing every business, every public service, every humanitarian intervention that is going on right now. And despite it not being a human and not even being a living being, maybe, depends on how you define what is living, it is the most prominent actor of our society. So I was wondering, have you ever considered that a virus would be the most essential actor, And how does that affect how we develop or engineer projects or products, etc.? So yeah, I think we have to think about other actors that are important, like climate change, deforestation, species extinction, ocean pollution, in the same way as we think about, yes, as we think about the human, because the human needs shouldn't be in the center, but the needs of all the actors involved. So I really like that little wheel that Ashley had, because it shows that there is an intersectionality of everything, right? We're not just one identity. I'm not just a human being. I'm not just a sister. I'm not just a daughter, but I'm the sum of all of these things. So in my practice, I do a paradigm shift towards environment-centered design, towards incorporating indigenous African ways of thinking and knowing. Because if you think, for instance, about Western tradition is based a lot about the philosophy that is influenced by the Cartesian cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. That kind of influenced the way that individualism became more prominent in the West, whereby if you look at South African philosophy, which is Ubuntu, right? They think I am because we are. You know, we are the sum of the atoms and the sum of everything. So that changes also the way you approach things, because if you don't feel yourself as being having a subject object separation, then you don't objectify things, but you see them as part of your, as an extension of yourself. And that's what many indigenous cultures do, you know. Nature is a part of themselves. They see themselves as the stewards of nature. So because of that, the way they respect it is also important. And one last point I want to make. In current society, we think in terms of short-term thinking. So I would also propose that a curriculum should incorporate ideas about long-term philosophies. Because short-term thinking, you know, we think in terms of quarters, seconds, you know, stuff like that. But if you look at long-term thinking, influenced by indigenous ways of being, they believe that whatever decision they make, not, especially a lot of South American cultures think that whenever they have to make very important decisions, they think of incorporating people from 7 generations in the future in all the decision making. So imagine what impact that has on the way you design and engineer. So, thank you.
Yeah, I think also just to add, it's how we're telling the stories of engineering. I think it's in the way that we're delivering the content as well. If you ask a young student what they think a future engineer is, what they think they're going to study, the perception is very different. Some will tell you, I'm going to be very rich and successful because I'm an engineer. They'll tell you different reasons why they think they need to jump into engineering, but it's how we're telling that story, or narrating that story about what engineering is. And as a young engineer myself, it's only by sitting down with people like you on this panel, it's only by sitting down with my mentors and realizing that engineering has a bigger cause. And in a small environment, I might go on site, and when we're trying to design a new treatment plant for a water board, but then what is the impact? We're trying to make sure that there isn't drought in 2025, that there is water supply in our city. Now that's a bigger cause. In a smaller scale, I'm thinking, I'm just going to get my paycheck at the end of the day, but it's the narrative, it's how we're feeding the information out there, and even how lecturers are delivering that content. Dr. Olson, you talked about your students battling with their personal identities and professional identities. I battled this as well because most people don't know this, the work that I do with women is volunteer basis. So I take time from my leave days. I drive out to rural areas with some female engineers, and we go out and talk about STEM, inspiring young girls who would never have a chance to meet a female engineer, yet alone a working woman. So at the same time, we're looking at not only thinking that they might end up doing engineering, but then we're also curbing the child marriage rates that are very high in these rural areas. So at first I had the battle between, okay, I love the volunteer work that I do, but at the same time, I'm a traditional civil engineer. But then when I looked at the bigger impact, how can I tell young girls that I'm an engineer if I'm not even thriving in the engineering industry? So I think it's how we're telling those stories as well, how we're narrating those stories. And one of the things I'm thankful for one of my lecturers in varsity, learning transportation planning. And I remember he mentioned that in rural areas, the most transportation that is meant by women. And a lot of times when there's high transportation, high movement in rural areas, it shows that they have a willpower to alleviate poverty. And I said, oh, that is an interesting way of looking at it. I'm not just designing a transportation network or system, but there's a bigger cause. So for me, Dr. Kwocha changed my mindset of how I saw civil engineering.
Maybe can I just come back to what was said by Asha on the human-centered or environment-oriented. This is not necessarily a mismatch, I'd say, when we talk about it in the sustainability projects we're working in, we consider a clean and functioning a natural environment as a human value, right? So I don't think it's a trade. It has to be a trade-off. It's if we consider meaningless consumption a human value, of course, then we are we are not going in the right direction. But I think as a basic right that can still work. And I believe that there's a notion that's getting more and more attention, and I really like to work with it. And this is the notion of flourishing instead of sustainability. So flourishing would mean really to thrive. So where both the natural environment and the humans in any context are able to thrive, right, and able to expand to the fullest potential and reach that potential. And I think this is most important also to go a bit to define some targets. I'm not really in the position to say what this means for engineering exactly, but I know that when we talk from a management perspective about it, it's the flourishing notion gives us quite a bit more positive power than sustaining an anyway unsustainable system.
I would like to add one point here. I think in any discipline, like my background is in international political science. So one skill I find very, very important is the skill of critical reflection, critical research, to be able to question your own discipline and to always strive to think about what's next, what could be next, what is missing, and to really develop that um, as a practice. I think this is really important.
Just say there's so much to touch on here. I don't even really know where to start, but I'll just go back to what Faith was talking about, the women in the rural villages bringing the transportation. So these are the engineers, and these are the voices that have to be in the design process as well. But the other lens that I'll bring in is that we often think about human-centered design in terms of who's using something, but I think another important aspect is who's not, like who doesn't have access to the things that we're putting out there. Because when we think about only the people that have the access, we're kind of not seeing the inequities that are created when one group is advanced and another isn't. And so I can put the environmental justice into that as well. So both the users and the non-users, everything that gets into, like when one community gets a water system and the neighboring one doesn't, there's a dynamic that's created. And I think that has to go into engineering and sort of just widening the sphere of who we're considering in our practice.
Great. Thank you so much to our panelists on answering these like really, I guess, thought-provoking questions, and definitely with some really awesome responses. I know I've learned a lot in these mini panels today. And so I want to kind of start wrapping up the session. And I first want to thank all of our panelists today for such insightful responses and for tuning in from all over the world. I know we've got some people out in Seattle, so it is early. And I know we've got, friends in South Africa, tuning in from Malawi, Benin, anywhere. So I'm really excited to kind of see, and I'm inspired as a young person to kind of see the future of this, I guess, engineering in general. So I also want to take time to thank Lara, who's helped me kind of organize this panel, and for the entire Peace Innovation team who's helped organize this particular sub-theme as well. How we communicate, how we engage, and how we share knowledge is going to directly impact the future of our generations, of the environment. And so if we can build empathy and, like Aisha too mentioned, have an ecologically focused future, I think I'm excited to see what the engineers of tomorrow look like. So thank you to everyone who joined us for today's session, and have a great rest of your morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are.
Thank you, Rachel.
Yeah, thank you all for organizing.
Thanks for great moderation. Thanks. Bye.
Yeah, thank you. This was fantastic.
Wonderful.
Thank you. It was so amazing to meet you guys.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for being here. I was very I don't know how to explain how incredible it was to listen to you all. So hacks from Colombia, it was difficult at the first time waking up at 5 a.m. but that was amazing.
Worth it.
Yes, totally.